So I want to actually start with you, Megan, because you have been researching this question about employee activism for 8 years now. You have been working on studying this phenomenon. And I'm curious, 2013, which seems like a millennia ago, set the stage for us. Why did you get into the question of studying employee activism? And at a high level, how have these questions changed between then and now?
Yes, thank you. Well, I began researching, we've been running a big research project with my co-author, John Higgins, called Speaking Truth to Power. So what we've been interested in is what we call conversational habits. Essentially, at an individual, team and organisational level, what gets said and who gets heard. And what are the consequences of that? And what habits do we fall into around when we speak up, when we stay silent, who we listen to and whose voice we discount? And actually it's over the last couple of years that I'd say that I've seen a really interesting change in some of the dynamics in organisations, and that's when we've really started looking in at activism in particular. I mean, what we've had over the last, I'd say, about 5 years is a big focus by many organisations on speaking up. So I've been working with lots of organisations and leaders who are running kind of speak up campaigns where they're inviting and occasionally demanding that employees speak up. And of course, leaders have also been saying wonderful things like, you know, bring your whole selves to work. And I think what's happened is that particularly over the last couple of years, some of those employees have kind of listened to this and gone, oh, okay, that's nice. Right, let's talk about climate change. I know, let's talk about gender. Let's talk about race equity. That would be really bringing my full self to work. So what do we kind of think about that? And I'd say, you know, what I'm seeing is a number of leaders and managers doing a bit of a double take and kind of going, oh, well, when I said speak up, not sure I entirely meant about that. So we've got many leaders and managers, I think, you know, being asked and invited into conversations that they're not used to. You know, we're no longer in the kind of traditional business remit. We are now in the wider social and environmental realm. And up until this point, up until quite recently, leaders have managed to pretend, I think, fantasize that they're running a kind of independent organization here that they can kind of control and know the answers to. So I'm sure we'll get into this in the conversation now, is that it's kind of a really different orientation of seeing the organisation and therefore the leader's role in a very different participatory manner and how we are participating and part of some of these really, really urgent social and environmental questions. Now, how do we speak up about that? How do we enable people to talk about that? And then how do we cope when we don't know the answers? And I know that Hubert and Christian will probably have quite a bit to say in that realm as well. So that's broadly what I've been researching with John and the kind of changes and the shifts that we've been seeing, particularly in the last couple of years. And it's fascinating how it is disrupting power inside our organizations.
I know that as part of your study around speaking truth to power, you've talked about some of the traps that employees fall into. If you were actually advising someone, you know, we can take both sides of this equation, and I'm going to be curious later on to ask about what leaders can do. But if you were advising someone who was hearing this or watching, who was an aspiring employee activist who really wanted to make a difference in their corporation, what are some do's and some don'ts that they need to be mindful of so that they can actually be as effective as possible in their advocacy role? What would you say?
So we've interviewed many activists and coded those interviewed and looked for some themes, looked for some traps that they fall into, and looked for some advice that they would give other activists. So a few things to mention here. Firstly, this shouldn't have been a surprise and yet it was a little bit. Top code from our interview analysis from activists was listening. So it wasn't the acting that came out the big thing. The big thing that activists were telling us was just like, in order to be effective within these systems, you feel passionately about something, but you got to have your ears open and listening. And that's because that will then enable you to see different perspectives that you can't see, to understand, for example, positions that managers and leaders might be in and the decisions that they have to make and the information that they have to go on. But it also enables you to understand how to navigate the politics of speaking up, because speaking up is a political act. Your activism is going to affect people's agendas, so how do you do that? And we borrowed the term, you may have heard this, one of my favourite terms in academia, Meyerson and Scully's term, tempered radicalism. So the idea is that, you know, when we want to change a system, when we want to influence a system, we need to be radical, don't we? We need to be different in order to shift and influence things. When we're too radical, the system can't cope with us. It spits us out. So we have to temper that radicalism. And part of that is kind of political astuteness. How do I kind of manage my passion and my understanding here so that I can speak up in a way that will be heard? Because if I'm ejected from the system, I might not be able to influence it. But how you navigate, because of course then the danger is you temper too much and now you don't have any impact. So one of the things I would say is, you know, a trap is when you go in full of passion but not willing to be able to see the other perspective. Another trap is when we go too radical or too tempered. And I think the final trap, which I was really moved by, is I don't think we talk to a single activist. I really don't know that we talk to a single activist who didn't at some stage experience burnout. So when you are inside a system, constantly chipping away at the status quo and majority perspective, that can be extraordinarily wearing after a period of time. It brings to mind one particular activist I talked to, and I talked to this person over the space of about a year and a half at regular instances, and she utterly blew me away. She was one of the most articulate, amazing people I've ever encountered. And then as we had the conversation through the year and a half, you could just see she was getting more and more worn down. And at the end of the period, she was just like, you know what? I've had it. I can't do it anymore. And that actually, it was devastating. And to see what this organisation was losing as a result of just kind of squeezing that energy out of her was one of the most frustrating things I've seen as a researcher. So the final thing for activists is, yes, of course, it's resilience. So how do you do that? You create spaces where you can connect and you speak collectively as well. So how do you collaborate and join with others who are going to speak with you? Because not only does that reduce the risk somewhat, but it also gives you a powerful source of energy and resilience. And you can kind of hand the baton over slightly and somebody else can start chipping away and then you hand it back again. So those are the elements, you know, you listen. Listening is fundamental. How you go into a system and act on that spectrum is also critical. And how you look after yourself and how you speak up collectively so you can keep that energy are really, really important points that we found in our research.
what is the best way to respond to employee activism, and what is the worst? What is the thing we definitely should not be doing if we're leaders? All right, go for it.
Okay, this is a challenge. I've written so many points down from listening to both of you speak. I'm going to have to choose and pick. Can I first mention something that we haven't actually talked about, but does need a quick mention here? We're using the word activism, and that if you're talking about how do we move business activism into the mainstream, we do have to acknowledge the fact that that label is really helpful in some places and really unhelpful in others. We've studied what does activism mean to people, and it means everything from sort of protest and violence and rebellion right the way through to passion and change. And one of the first things that I recommend to leaders is that they, around the boardroom table, they talk about, what's our judgments and assumptions in the first place, because those frame our response that comes from it. So I would say that, to move to the mainstream, we need to get to grips with what we mean by activism. In some parts of the world, it's quite great to be labelled an activist, and in other parts of the world, that's life-threatening if you're called an activist. So I wanted to make that space. One other point before I go on to the taxonomy, we've talked about, Hubert, you talked about the motivation, intrinsic motivation that we have. And I generally agree with you. When I'm in a classroom with leaders and managers talking about purpose, it doesn't take them that long to tune into what matters. But the problem is, in our pathological busyness in the workplace, we don't have space to connect with some of the wider things that really matter to us. So, one of the things I'm most interested in is how do we as individuals and as organisation, and of course as a leadership practice as well, how do you create those spaces where we can make some of the choices that, actually do connect with what matters most? So, taxonomy, very quickly, Dori. So it starts at there's 6, non-existent. I've been into some organisations and I've mentioned the word activism, and literally I had a chief executive the other day that looked utterly baffled at what I was talking about. So it's just not in the territory. One step up, or not really a step up, suppression. It is in the conversation, but those voices, we might call them voices of difference, are suppressed either kind of knowingly or just they're made to feel so uncomfortable that they can't speak up. Then it shifts into something that we call facadism. And this connects back to that question again. What do we need to convert business activism into the mainstream? Well, as Greta so famously has said very recently, is we need to stop doing the blah, blah, blah. And we certainly do that at the corporate level as well. As my colleague John Higgins calls it, the corporate wallpaper around purpose and meaning. We talk a great deal, but where is the action underneath it? And then we tip into engagement, but the first step is defensive engagement. This is where organisations are responding, but only because they really have to. It's like, what's the least I have to do? I know, I'll count the number of women. That means we're doing stuff. That's the kind of defensive engagement. And here's where it gets quite interesting from what I would call reactive to proactive. And we get into dialogic engagement. And this is a fundamental change, that both Hubert and Christian have been referring to. Dialogue means we start from a point of view where we know we have a perspective, but we know it's that, a perspective. And we are leaning forward with genuine curiosity and inquiry to find out, what don't I know here, because I know I have a ton of blind spots. So why don't we get together and with curiosity share information and perhaps even decision making? And that's a massive change for organisations and of course for leadership practice. We end up on the taxonomy with something that I call stimulating activism, and this is the territory of the Ben & Jerry's and the Patagonias of the world, where they are recruiting and they are promoting activists and they are giving them space. They're paying the bail if they end up in prison over some of these issues. So here's your taxonomy, and I would say that the challenge to organisational leaders is, who have been running scared for quite a while and saying that, you know, things like they're apolitical, you know, we're neutral, we're going to stay out. Well, there is no such thing. Our inaction is as political as our action now. So I think it's time to be proactive, you know, to lean in forwards and know that you don't know the answer and kind of try and figure this out together. So final word, business activism to mainstream tomorrow, going back to something Hubert said, is we have to change the narrative, don't we? We have to change the narrative around leadership to allow for the fact that good leadership means that curiosity, that willingness to understand that our perspective is so, you know, narrow, and we have to really, really encounter and try and stimulate different perspectives around us. How do we separate data from power is a question I have, because I know there's been a few conversations today where we've focused the answer again on, like, it's data. It's got to be data. Really quick story. Chief Operating Officer of a major global bank said to us in one of the interviews, we were talking to him about the financial crash, and he said to us, it got to the stage in the bank where the only people that believed in the data that the board was receiving was the board. In other words, at each level, the data kind of got slightly polished and put different perspectives on. So, you know, I'm going to slightly change that question and kind of say, you know, when we're in positions of power, the data we receive needs to be questioned in the first place. And you know, absolutely we need to draw in data, but can we go a step, don't take it as the answer. We need to question that data and where it's come from. And that's been a bit of a theme in some of the other conversations that we've had today as well.